Todas las grandes ideas son el resultado del deseo de cumplir los sueños, de encontrar respuestas a incógnitas que antes se creían indescifrables. Son fruto de la fascinación por lo desconocido y la pasión de mentes brillantes dispuestas a conquistar las estrellas. Las grandes ideas son la huella indeleble de la existencia de la humanidad. No es solo lo que haces por ti, es lo que haces por el futuro. Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana.
Good morning to all the audience in Latin America, and good afternoon to all the spectators in Germany and Europe. Welcome to the last session of the second season of the HEPCoPa Lecture Series. And as always, it's an honor for us to be here with you, talking and also sharing new expectations about the accomplishment of the SDGs in Colombia, in Germany, and also in the rest of the world. I am Rafael Calles, the head of international affairs at UPB Bucaramanga, and let's start with this interesting presentation and lecture that we'll have today. So, as you know, the HEPCoPa project is a bilateral initiative developed jointly by Colombia and Germany, in which the University of Potsdam, Universidad de Caldas, Pontificia Universidad Javeriana Cali, the Colombian Universities Association ASCUN at the Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana Bucaramanga have worked together since 2019 to build up capacities in the areas of quality, digitalization, and management in higher education. This exercise in the HEPCoPa Lecture Series is part of the digitalization pillar that we were working since 2019. So it's very grateful for us to complete the second season of the HEPCoPa Lecture Series today. So we have an incredible high profile invite today and a very good profile to know more about the accomplishment of an interesting topic related to sustainability and all the environmental side of the accomplishment of the SDGs. So let me introduce you to Dr. Herman Bersali. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Energy Transition and Public Policy Research Group at the IASS Potsdam, and also his research combines ecological economics with other social sciences and focuses on policies and transformative changes toward a carbon-free economic system. He's currently working on three interrelated questions: crisis and structural change, policy packages for complete decarbonization in the global north and the global south, and European energy policy and decentralization. So, Dr. Herman, it's an honor to have you here today, and welcome to the HEPCoPa Lecture Series.
Thank you very much, Rafael. It's a pleasure to me to be here online with you. So I'm connected now from Berlin. Normally work in Potsdam, and so I'm very happy to be also sharing this panel with all the students and professors in Colombia.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so should we start with the presentation of the slides? Share a screen. Let's see, it should work.
Yeah, it's working and we can
Yes.
see the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So I wanted to say just to start that I working at the same institute and the same research group that the professor Johan Liljestam, who presented here, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. My presentation so is somehow complementary of a continuation in somehow of his presentation. However, it's the first time that I'm here with you, and it's the first time that I take part of this very, very interesting initiative. And so I know that our students, mainly master students, are from different disciplines and also from different, different backgrounds. And I didn't know how much you exactly know about climate policies, because today we are going to talk a little bit more about climate change policy, specifically mitigation policies. And so I try to make a presentation that is understandable for different profiles. At the same time, for a question of time, I'm not going to explain every single concept. If you don't know some of these concepts, there is absolutely no problem. You can ask me later um, in the chat or in the questions and answer sections. Good. And so the topic today, as Rafael just said, is policy package or policy mixes for complete decarbonization. And I would like to make a reflection here about how this question applies or is different in the global north and the global south. Yeah, global north of countries, say industrialized countries, and countries in the global south that are also implemented or supposed to implement climate change mitigation policies. At the background, we have, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, but here specifically we have also the question of the Paris Agreement. We are in a phase of implementing the Paris Agreement. And we are in a phase where the NDCs have to be updated, the national determined contributions, with new objective, new target for decarbonizing all national economies and leading to a carbon neutral energy system and economic system by 2050 or early. And when we talk about the NDC and the implementing the NDC, then we need policy instruments. We are in a phase of instrumentation, but of course, policies, environmental policy instruments is not a new thing. We are not started today. We know there are quite a lot of experience in different countries, and there are also theories and more theoretical or modeling exercises that have been done. So we have a good basis of knowledge about which policies are needed. And we also know that actually the policies that have been implemented so far have been effective and in slowing down the increase on CO2 emissions, and in some cases are allowed decreases in CO2 emissions. However, the policies implemented so far in the global north are not sufficient to go to a 1.5 or near to 1.5 degrees target, and we need to go for most ambitious energy and climate policies. And also we need the implementation of such policies in more and more countries in the global south, because at the end of the day, all the global economy have to be carbon neutral. And on that, I will mention today, I will introduce some theories coming particularly from economics that are the basis sometimes for the analysis of the different policy measures, the policy instruments. Second, I will introduce what are the evaluation criteria that are considered or in the literature when evaluating climate mitigation policies. And then I will refer to main policy instruments and some facts that we know for experience, and also emphasize what we don't know so far. Okay, let's see. Yeah, now it's working again. So a fundamental question is, considering the limited financial and political capital to implement climate mitigation policies, which policy instruments should governments in the global south implement first? The question of the limited financial and political capacity applies for both countries in the global north and the global south, but is more important in this last group. And so countries have to make choices. Which instruments should be implemented, and should this instrument and the resulting policy mixes be the same that in countries in the global north, or what are the differences, and what really know if we know something about that? First, just to remember or to introduce the classical classification of policy instruments in environmental policies that also applies to specifically to climate mitigation policy, distinguishes three groups: economics instruments, for example, or carbon taxes, emission trading systems like the EU ETS, but also tax credits, grants, renewable energy support in the form of subsidies or in the form of financial support like loan guarantees and others, and R&D subsidies. On the other hand, there are the regulatory instruments, including, for example, the performance and technology standards that have been applied in many countries for energy efficiency measures, for example. And here we have also, the phase out mandates as the most extreme case of a standard that will finish in a certain year to totally ban a specific technology. For example, the phase out of internal combustion vehicles by 2035 that have been approved in some countries. Then we have the category more generic one that says other instruments. I don't like too much the name other instrument because it seems it's less important, that actually is not. But here there are a variety of instruments, including information programs, but also public support for green infrastructure or corporate carbon reporting, among others. That is not the only classification that policy instrument. There are several others, and sometimes the classifications are somehow overlapping. But one distinction that we also find quite often in the literature is the reference to market-based instruments, especially carbon taxes and emission trading systems, and other instruments that sometimes are called also with the word regulatory instrument, or sometimes are they called command and control policies. Good. And when I mentioned that, what are the theories? And here the evaluation, the design and the evaluation of climate mitigation policies is an interdisciplinary task. Economists have taken a good part of that job, but there's economists and also political scientists and researchers for many other disciplines. It's a multidisciplinary field, but many of the concepts on environmental policies actually come or relate somehow to an economic theory. And I would say there are three, or one principle, but there are three that apply. In that case, we have behavioral and organizational economics, where the emphasis is in on optimizing individual and organizational behavior. Then we have neoclassical and public welfare economics, that is the core of environmental economics. That is from where come most the analysis and the policy recommendations in the area. And neoclassical economics emphasize the question of maximization of social welfare, minimizing costs, and the most rational use of resources. And then we have evolutionary and institutional economics that will focus more on the technical and organizational innovations and also on technological and structural change. The question here is interesting to see to which extent this series or this theoretical approach are complementary or they are opposites between them. And we are going to see some statement later in this presentation. When we go to neoclassical economics, we see the importance here of markets and prices. So in this branch of economics, all the modeling exercises doing is emphasize the importance of having multiple actors in the market, so avoiding the question of monopolies and other market distortions, also avoiding barriers to enter, to access these markets, etc. And also emphasize the importance of prices, that prices actually reflect the real cost of producing, transporting, and distributing energy. And also that these prices internalize the environmental damage caused by fossil fuels and other form of energy. And also in general, these approaches will emphasize the necessity of avoid distortions like subsidies. So the policy recommendation that derive from this approach in general is carbon pricing as the first best, in the sense that is a market-friendly policy option. Carbon pricing that could be implemented, as I say before, in the way of carbon taxes or ETS, emission trading systems. However, on the evolutionary and institutional economics, carbon pricing is not necessarily the most important instrument. And that is because the emphasis in the analysis is in other aspects, actually in evolutionary and an institutional approach. The focus is in how we go from the current socio-technical regime that favors fossil fuels, how we transit to the new one based on renewables and other um, zero carbon technologies. And for that, the most important is to see how we adapt infrastructure to the needs of the new, how we adapt institutions in order that these technologies, that the new zero carbon technologies can develop and deploy massively in different economies. And also it's important here to consider the interests of the different parts that are involved in this political and economic and social process. So here, the collaborations with other social science and other disciplines, including engineering, of course, is much more evident in that approach. Let's say there is the evolutionary part and the institutional part. And also it's relates very, very closely with what we call now transition studies. Then moving to what is the criteria for evaluating climate change mitigation policies. There are several different criteria, but here we'll mention the most important one is environmental effectiveness. What are the impacts of that policy on emissions reductions? And that is the question of which indicator do we use. And here we have to be very, very careful, because some NDCs or some articles that will evaluate public policies or different scenarios will base the conclusions in reductions in total or absolute CO2 emissions, while others will build the conclusions based in improvement in carbon intensity of GDP, for example, but not necessary in a real reduction of CO2 emissions. So we have to be very careful when we compare that. And in practice, when performing this kind of evaluation, what is very challenging is how to isolate the effects of a specific policy from the effect of other policies or other macroeconomic and political factors. Then there is a second group of criteria for evaluating mitigation policies. That is the question of um, the economic evaluation, in the sense of integrating, yes, the effectiveness, the result of the policy, but also the cost, how much it costs. And here there are different criteria. Actually, I'm not going to explain in detail because I noticed that I'm already in 20 minutes. I have to really advance more. But here is important. One of the important criteria is the cost effectiveness. So having a specific goal, what are the policy or the policies that will allow to reach that goal at minimal cost? That is cost effectiveness. Also, when related to the criteria of equity, some analysis will focus on the distributional effects of climate policies. So how the cost will repercuted among different social economics groups in the society, but also how these groups will benefit from the co-benefits that derive from many of the climate mitigation policies. Co-benefits, I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's a very, very important topic too. The third group of criteria are related to the system transformation criteria, more related to the approach, institutional and evolutionary approach. So what are the impacts of a policy instrument on innovation and deployment of zero carbon technologies? And how a policy instrument or different policies instruments will allow the adaptation of infrastructure and institutions to the new system that we are transiting to. Here we see that there are already very, very important differences in what are the criteria that are used to evaluating climate policies, and some of them are more important depending also on the theoretical approach of the analysis. And here I wanted to present you very briefly some statements from the IPCC report, the last IPCC report published this year, the chapter 13. And we see, for example, economic theory suggests that carbon pricing policies are on the whole the more cost effective than regulation or subsidies in reducing emissions. And that's a statement that very, very relates to the neoclassical paradigm in environmental economics. At the same time, it says prices and especially the ETS and carbon taxes allow promote the implementation of low cost emissions reductions. So the lower hanging fruits. And now we have acquired more experience on that. However, we have to be careful here because what we know so far, the experience that we have so far in ex post evaluation of what are the effects of carbon taxes or ETS is almost exclusively based on developed countries in the global north. And we know very little actually how effective are these policy instruments in practice when applied to countries in the global south. Regarding the economics instruments and here the technology support, well, we have subsidies like feed-in tariff, to support, for example, renewable energy projects, or to support also, for example, electric vehicles. They have been effective in deploying renewable energy in many countries, but sometimes can lock in subsidies for long periods of time. So part of the literature have criticized also some of the instruments to be considered to be too costly. However, there is no clear agreement on that. Um, there was a transition of many countries to feed-in premium tariff as a result of an auction system, tender system that tends to be more market friendly. But again, that is applicable mainly for countries in the global north, and it's not necessary uh, the most relevant criteria for countries in the global south. Um, and here also how we evaluate the effect of, for example, feed-in tariff, it depends also on the temporal perspective, because as it says here in the last statement, support for rollout clean technology at high prices can be economically beneficial in the long run if costs are reduced greatly as a function of deployment. And that is exactly what happened with renewable energy, where countries like Germany, Denmark, several others have supported renewable for many years when they were very expensive, and there was a lot of critique of that. They say, oh, that is not very cost efficient. However, when you look in a more long-term perspective, these efforts have allowed um, very huge, substantial reductions in the cost of technologies like wind, solar PV, and several other related technologies. Concerning regulatory instruments, here we see that, for example, standards, performance standard or technology specific standards. We see that mitigation by regulation often enjoys greater political support than, for example, carbon pricing, but tends to be more economically costly than mitigating by pricing instruments. That's a statement also related in part to the neoclassical approach. Um, from an energy system, in the last statement, we see from an energy system transformation perspective. So here we go to the last institutional and evolutionary theory. Technology standards, including phase-out mandates, have particular promise to achieve profound change in specific sectors and technologies. So here we see that actually this theory that I presented at the beginning actually appears somehow in the policy's recommendation and the policy conclusion when we read the report and when we read what we know so far about the performance of this instrument. And it's not necessary that one is completely wrong and the other is completely right, but also they will emphasize different aspects of that such policy, and also sometimes there are also tensions between uh, looking at the short term or having a more long term perspective. There are other instruments that I'm not going in detail now for a question of time. The information programs, very important. For example, energy audits that have proved to be effective in several countries. Again, experience with ex post evaluations only in countries in the global north, or mainly countries in the global north. Then we have financial accounting standards or eco-labeling. Another very important instrument is the public support for green infrastructure or low carbon infrastructure, because of course we can support the deployment of wind power or solar power, but if we don't have the electricity network, If it doesn't progress at the same time or before, so it's not going to work. The same for electric car, for example. If we don't develop the necessary infrastructure, so the takeoff of electric car is not going to happen either. So in some cases, there is a need for public support or reorienting the, the investment in infrastructure into more greener infrastructure. And sometimes it happens or may happen or accelerate in time of crisis, as was the case during the global financial crisis, but also and especially during the COVID crisis. We see that many countries have implemented a stimulus package, and within the stimulus package, many have included green stimulus, green component, in many cases supporting technologies and supporting also infrastructure. But here we can see a very clear divide between the global north in blue here in this graph and countries in the global south. We see that the first group have invested in 2020 and 2021 substantially more per capita in green stimulus, which will have repercussions for the climate mitigation, from a climate mitigation perspective, but also it have consequences for the economic and industrial development of these countries. We are approaching to the end of the presentation, but it's important to mention here that I mentioned very rapidly different policy instruments, but then at the end of the end of the day, what is important is how we combine, because normally one policy instrument is not going to tackle all the barriers for the transition to a zero carbon energy system. So we need in general multiple instruments. So creating policy package for climate change mitigation. But then if we add more complexity to that, we need to see what are the interactions with the policy dedicated to adaptation to climate change, very important too. Interactions with other sustainable development goals, so how this policy will affect, for example, positively or negatively biodiversity conservation. And what are the interactions between monetary, fiscal policies, and other macroeconomic variables. Regarding policy package and the effectiveness of policy package, actually, we don't know too much but there are more and more research that have been doing, but so far the research have focused in general in a specific instrument and not in policy mixes. Economists have focused more on interactions between carbon pricing and other policy instruments, so and how this interaction will affect the cost of implemented climate mitigation policy, while the literature on social technical transitions, evolutionary perspective highlight the need for different policy package and different policy focus depended on the stage of the transition. So the stage of the transition in the electricity sector in Germany could be very different to the state of the transition, the electricity sector in Colombia or in Argentina or wherever. And it could be also very different if we compare sector per sector, like the industrial sector, transport sector, etc., etc. So the right policy mix for the right sector at the right stage of the transition. Then we can, we don't have time now, but we could also discuss when we integrate the political economic constraints, how we can do sequencing of policies in order to have a more effective and more acceptable policy mix. Just one of the last slide I prepared this graph because I say several times, actually, we don't know how really too much about how this policy instrument works in the global south. We have actually relatively few ex post policy evaluations when of policy instruments when we compare the global south and the global north. Here in the graphic on the right, we see that actually most of the publications on these topics are produced in the global north, here in red Europe particularly, and take it mainly cases in the global north. We have Europe, the US, other countries in the global north, and then in yellow here we have countries in the global south, where the part of the research have increased a little bit, especially by China, but still outside the global north and China, we don't know too much. To conclude, to finish some final reflections, I wanted to say we need multiple instruments to tackle the different barriers, but at the same time we need to be very careful. We pay attention on what are the interactions between the policy instrument, because sometimes could be overlapping, but also the interactions between the policy instrument and other policy aims. Another point very important to consider is that the most cost-effective policy in the short term may not be the most cost-effective policy in the long term. And finally, we need much more research about policy instrumentation in the global south. And here I invite all of you, especially the colleagues in Colombia, to yeah to engage on this kind of research. Good. So I will finish here. I took some more minutes because I knew Rafael told me that we don't have a second presenter today. That is why the presentation was a little bit longer. And now I'm happy to answer some of your questions.
Dr. Herman, thank you so much for this participation. I think that it's pretty interesting, and also because, as you said at the start of your lecture, we had the opportunity to know more about the process of Dr. Johan Lilienstam 2 weeks ago. So this is like the second part and the second chapter and the follow up of that approach, and it's very important because are totally sure that universities could have an excellent opportunity and also an excellent role to promote these kind of policy packages, because in the case of Latin America we are looking that probably the public sector is trying to promote and is trying to highlight this kind of issues and also to promote some solutions, but we have also a responsibility from the research point as universities to do the follow-up and to go ahead with that kind of processes. And obviously we have the capacities and the skills to develop that kind of opportunities to support. So thank you so much for this approach. We have a couple of questions in the YouTube chat, Dr. Kerman. I will start with a question from Jörg Hafer, our colleague of the University of Potsdam. And the question is, which of the approaches could have the fastest success? Will not this be the preferred option?
Sorry, so which of the approach can have, could you repeat please? Just one.
Yes, of course. Which of the approaches could have the fastest success? And will not this be the preferred option? Probably it's talking about like short-term facilities or opportunities to overcome.
Yeah, and so yeah, it's a very complicated question because actually which policy package or I don't know exactly if maybe the question refers to the theoretical approach or to the policy package that
Yeah,
derives
that's
from
the
that.
approach because it was in the first part
It
of
was
the
the
lecture.
first for the first time, the first part. Okay, so I could say, well, it really depends on the perspective, but I could say that um, when we need to reduce emissions but not necessarily go to zero, uh, it makes completely sense to try to take the most cost-effective solutions in the short term and go for that first. And so, and that was in some cases enough. But then, with the perspective of the Paris Agreement, where we know that we need to go to a zero carbon energy system and zero carbon economy. I'm not talking here about too much about agriculture because there are other policies that apply. Here I'm talking mainly about energy and transport and industry. But because we know that we need to go to net zero, so we need to transform the system. So the policies and the infrastructure that we developed today have to fit the zero carbon future system. So for example, gaining efficiency in, I don't know, in technologies based on oil and gas, yeah, can have an effect in the short term, but will have little impact in a zero carbon system. So from that regard, I would say that taking into account the technological and structural development is very important.
Thank you so much. The second question, Dr. Herman, is from Enrique Barbosa, and he said, at the current rate that measures are being implemented worldwide, many experts are concerned that we are not reacting fast enough to climate change. How could a change in approach speed things up?
Mm, so the question basically, how can we speed up the process, yeah, or
Yeah.
implemented more ambitious climate policies that is actually the what is intended, at least for some parts in the negotiation. There was little success about that on the last COP in Egypt, unfortunately. But at the same time, there are many countries that are doing many things at national level and that try to advance in more ambitious climate mitigation policies. And in some cases, it comes also by social pressure from individuals, from citizens, sometimes legal pressure from the legal constitutional courts, for example, in several cases here in Europe. But what is important, I think, is maybe I should refer a little bit to the sequencing approach. That is something that have been discussed by political scientists, by the economists also, how to gain acceptance in the policies, because the problem is that in general, people will say, yes, we have to act against climate change. We need to implement climate change mitigation policies, but at the same time, there is sometimes a cost to pay in the short term. And so how the different part will be affected and how the the group of interest related to fossil fuel will be affected, that can really complicate the implementation of policy in many countries. So one of the approach is sequencing, trying to introduce, for example, green industrial policy, try to develop at the beginning sectors that will create new jobs, that will create new economic opportunities, and with that will create also support in the new. And then when there are these possibilities in the market and the technologies exist, at the same time applied more rigorous policies that will phase out the most polluting technologies. There are different forms of sequencing. We could speak more in detail, but that is an important approach. And also another thing that's very important is also to talk about that, to inform about that more in many countries. I talk, for example, about my home country, that is Argentina. I come from originally from Argentina, where I did part of my studies. And actually, climate change is not a big topic in the sense that it's not a topic, like it's not present in the press, in the political discussion as it is here in Europe, in Germany, in France. I did my PhD in France, and there is a big difference. I don't know exactly how is the case in Colombia, But in many countries, actually, yes, it's a topic, but really secondary one. So informing about that is also very important.
Yeah, very well. Thank you for that, Dr. Herman. We have another question, and it's related to how do you assess the changes in policy related to the attack on Ukraine and the sanctions, even in the global south? That's a very current topic.
Yes, very current and very important, also very relevant. All very interesting question. Thanks a lot for that. And actually, we know that we have I have been working in a paper on the effects of past economic and political crises on decarbonization, how they will affect CO2 emissions drivers and how they will affect structural change and also the policies. And we see that actually there are effects and sometimes big effects of past crises. And in this case, the energy crisis resulting from the war in Ukraine is not the exception. So it's triggering very important change. In the short term, some of this change could be negative. For example, here Germany is going to use a little bit more coal to produce electricity, which is extremely polluting. It's not good. More coal because the shortage of gas. The same in some countries in east of Europe. At the same time, it's promoting it's promoting transformation in many sectors in terms of reduce substantially the consumption of energy and increasing efficiency. And in some cases, it's accelerated the transformation of some industries with the support, and that is important also the support of government. So some industry that we are planning to a transition to green form of productions by 2030, 2040 can do that now. Have the possibility because have the economic pressure because of the very high gas prices, and no one is expecting that prices actually will fall in the coming years. Not are not going to fall substantially at least. So I could say that in the short term, some probably negative effects or mixed effects because we have less consumption, but also have a little bit more dirty consumption. But in the middle and the long term, the effects will be positive.
Yeah, it's totally a curious phenomenon, but it's part of the study cases and the study processes that probably could encourage and also to strengthen the opportunities to do research in the future. And we have a last question, Dr. Herman. How do we help and stimulate governments in the global south to implement more measures towards decarbonization?
That is a good question too, and I think was the one of the big topics in the discussions in the last COP that just finished some days ago in Egypt, because yeah, in countries in the global south there is the question that some maybe they are not very interested in supporting the new because they say we have fossil fuels industry, etc. But other governments, yes, do want to contribute to climate change mitigation and implement policies. But the question is that the financial and fiscal situation there is very different. The constraints are much um, more relevant in the global south. Even countries with middle or middle of high middle level of GDP per capita, like Colombia or Argentina, they have very substantial program to, and especially Argentina, to have access to funding. To how we finance all the new when you have inflation rate that are very high, and they don't have the possibility to implement um, ambitious climate mitigation policies with governmental support in some cases. So one form to incentivize them is trying to targeting international funders, for example, through international development banks, for example, targeting this funding to more sustainable um, sustainable development goals, and in particular to climate change mitigation. There are some steps on that direction, but still we need a lot to do. We have done many things wrong in the past also. Again, I give the example of Argentina, that have received quite a lot of funds in the in previous years for that, but instead of going to real investment and transform the system, that was really went to the financial sector or other sectors that doesn't really contribute fundamentally to the transformation. So that have to be a topic that we need to advance more, definitely.
Yeah, totally. We don't have more questions, Dr. Herman, but it has been an incredible reflection part, and I think that these Q&A sessions could probably in the first step to know more about, for example, current phenomena and currently opportunities also to go for more research and also for funding in this case to support it, but also in the second hand it's an opportunity to look to the task and also the challenges that we are facing both in Germany and also in Latin America, and this perspective of the global south and the north and the global north. I think that it's very interesting because we have some differences in our ecosystems, but at the same time we are trying to looking for the same objective, and this all umbrella of SDGs also promoting that. So we have a common objective, and now we have more tasks, but also more orientation and a clear forecast about how to try to promote it and to work on it. Dr. Herman, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a pretty honor to have you and also to know more about your process, your knowledge, and also to these new policy packages that they're a very interesting approach from the point of view and the study points. So once again, thank you so much for being part of the HEPCoPa Lecture
Thank you.
Series.
Thank you very much for organizing, you and also the organizers in Potsdam at the Potsdam University. And I didn't see the face of the participants today, but I hope, yeah, we can also meet in other meetings in the future. And if we have a specific question or suggestions, my email appears in the last slide, so you can also contact me. I will be happy. So thank you, Rafael, and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Well, this is the final session, as I said before, of the second season of the HEPCoPa Lecture Series, and I want to say a big thank you to all the organizers behind this interesting action that we are trying to promote into the HEPCoPa project. So thank you so much to all the colleagues of the University of Potsdam, obviously to y'all, to Jinjan, and also to the professors, the professors and management staff of the University of Potsdam for support this interesting approach. Also, thank you so much to the other members of the HEPCoPa project, the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana Cali, ASCUN, also the Universidad de Caldas for all the support and for in two continued sessions support us and trying to be part of this interesting movement. So thank you so much also to all the spectators from day one to interact with us, to share questions, to have the opportunity to gain more attraction in this kind of opportunities, and also to be the real part and the direct audience to this interesting project. So our plan is to continue start working together probably during the 2023 to repeat these experiences, also trying to innovate and to add new feeders for the development of new activities related to the transfer of knowledge. So probably we'll have in touch at the start of the 2023 looking for a new opportunity to continue with this interesting HEPCoPa Lecture Series, and also with extracurricular opportunities and programs for the benefit of all the universities. So thank you so much for being with us, and see you in the 2023. Thank you.